Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. On this day in 1868, 15th United States President James Buchanan passed away. And I think this is notable because it's the closest that a president has ever been to dying in the month of May. We just concluded the month, and I didn't want to jinx it yesterday, so I didn't talk about that yesterday. But now that we're in June, I can talk all about how no president ever has died in the month of May. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. 10th President of the United States, John Tyler, is known for having the most amount of kids out of any other president. He's got a total of 15. 8 with his first wife, 6 with his second, and then another one with one of his slaves, because he did that. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. It is a historical fact that the Democratic Republican Party of the early 1800s evolved from the Anti-Federalist Party, which were a group that were opposed to the ratification of the Constitution. This is in contrast to the Federalists, who supported the ratification of the Constitution. However, the 4th president of the United States and only second ever Democratic Republican presidential candidate, James Madison, wrote the Constitution. So he was most definitely a Federalist at first. And this is reflected in his presidency, with most people agreeing that he actually probably was more of a Federalist than a Democratic Republican while in office. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. In the 1960s, President of France, Charles de Gaulle, withdrew from NATO's unified command structure and claimed that, hey, France needs some strategic independence. We don't want a single American troop on French territory. President Lyndon B. Johnson was like, okay, does that include the dead ones too? Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. We all know that the current First Lady is not an American. In fact, she was born in a country that doesn't even exist anymore, Yugoslavia, but now she identifies as Slovenian. However, she's not the First Lady. That's interesting to say. First Lady. Well, she's not the First Lady to be born outside the United States. That would go to Louisa Adams, the wife of 6th President John Quincy Adams, who was born in Britain. Yes, the United Kingdom, marrying an American. In fact, John Quincy Adams' parents, John Adams, who was the 2nd president, said, yo, you can't do this, my guy. But he was like, yo, I don't care. She's a baddie. Probably something like that. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Abraham Lincoln, the 16th president of the United States, was born on the 12th of February in 1809. Coincidentally, that's the exact same day that Charles Darwin was born. In fact, Charles Darwin actually congratulated Abraham Lincoln when getting elected. However, there's no concrete evidence that Abraham Lincoln even knew that Charles Darwin existed. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Today is the anniversary of the death of Andrew Jackson. He died on June the 8th in 1845. And what's interesting here is at his funeral, his pet parrot, which he had, continuously swore at the funeral procession and actually had to be removed from his owner's funeral. Again, because he was swearing all the time. The little parrot swearing. Could you imagine? Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Before getting into politics, the eventual 31st president of the United States, Herbert Hoover, was a minor. Well, yes, he was obviously under the age of 18, but he was also someone who literally worked the mines. He worked mines all over the place, in California, Australia, but most importantly for the short, China, because while he was there, he learned Mandarin Chinese and actually spoke it with his wife when they didn't want anybody to hear them. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. In his 1840 re-election campaign in the presidential election, President Martin Van Buren's supporters joined OK clubs to show their support for the president. Why OK? Well, he was called Old Kinderhook because he was from the town of Kinderhook in New York. Now, while this isn't the first documented use of the word OK, because it was in a newspaper a year prior, it definitely helped popularize the term, which at the time meant all correct. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. In late 1807, President at that time Thomas Jefferson signed the Embargo Act of 1807. What this was meant to do was prohibit trade between America and both of France and Great Britain. And this was really, really bad because France and Great Britain were America's two largest trading allies, I guess. And prohibiting those countries from trading with you, especially when you're a young nation, does not go well. The law backfired horribly, but it didn't seem to have much political consequences because less than a year later, the 1808 election was held, where his successor, James Madison, won big. Hello, I'm Desire500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Today, if you were alive, would be George H.W. Bush's 101st birthday. So I thought it'd make sense to make a fact about him. And the fact for today is that when it was the Great Depression, his parents were pretty rich. So he actually brought a full lunch to school, while the other kids didn't bring any lunch to school. So when George H.W. Bush, saw these kids with no lunch, he said, "Here, have half." And the other kids nicknamed him accordingly, Have Half. Hello, I'm Desire500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. They don't call the 5th president, James Monroe, a founding father for nothing. He was involved in the Revolutionary War quite extensively, actually. And he was actually there at the Battle of Trenton, famously where no Americans got injured, or some of them got injured, but none of them died, and a lot of British people died. Well, James Monroe, who was at the Battle of Trenton, was the only one seriously injured, and he very nearly died. Of course, had he died, he would have been the only American casualty at the Battle of Trenton. Hello, I'm Desire500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Today is the 14th of June. It's Flag Day in the United States. This is because we celebrate the day that the initial United States flag design was made. So I think it's very interesting to talk about the presidential fact of the day, being the fact that this is the longest time that we haven't had another flag change. It's the longest time that we have not added a new state. And this all started, with the 50 stars started back in 1960 when Dwight Eisenhower was president, making him the first president to serve under all 50 states. Hello, I'm Desire500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. This year marks the 250th anniversary of the United States Army, so I thought it'd be fitting to talk about it in this day and today's presidential fact of the day. And I think it's pretty cool how for about, if I'm doing the math right, 40-ish years, there was no president who had served in the military. From 1909 to 1945, William Howard Taft to Franklin Roosevelt, none of the presidents in that time frame served in the military. I think that's notable because during that time frame, both World War I and World War II happened. Hello, I'm Desire500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. The first person in the entire United States to have the breed of Siamese cat was actually Rutherford Hayes, the 19th president of the United States. And having the first Siamese cat in the entire country is pretty crazy. So what did he name it? Well, Siam. He named it Siam. Hello, I'm Desire500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. The 26th president of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt, was known for being a quite outdoorsy and loud person. One thing that he did to continue his reputation as that and managed to not get tired, even though he died at age 60, was drinking a liter of coffee every single day. Now, if you ask me, a liter of coffee is quite insane. Hello, I'm Desire500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. We now know that Mount Rushmore has 4 iconic American presidents on its walls, that being George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, and Theodore Roosevelt. However, Theodore Roosevelt wasn't really supposed to be there. He only ended up on Mount Rushmore because he was friends with the guy who sculpted it. Well, I think nowadays it's fair to say he deserves to be on Mount Rushmore. Hello, I'm Desire500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. When you think of the 32nd president of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, what comes to mind? Well, is it end of the Great Depression, start of World War II, Social Security? All of those are really good answers. But for me, for whatever reason it is, it's polio. Why that? Because he actually had polio. You may think of Roosevelt as those first three things because the media wanted you to think of that. They didn't want you to think about his polio and actually covered it up. But Roosevelt had a wheelchair and used it quite extensively. Hello, I'm Dazad 500 and this is your presidential fact of the day. The 21st president of the United States was named Chester Arthur, and he was actually born on the 5th of October, 1829. That in of itself isn't crazy, but what is crazy is that he claimed to be born in 1830. He claimed to be born on the 5th of October, 1830, out of sheer vanity, for so long that it's on his gravestone as his official birthday. If you went to his grave, it literally says, Chester Arthur, born the 5th of October, 1830. Hello, I'm Dazad 500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. On Friday, I talked about Chester Arthur and how he claimed that he was a year younger simply due to vanity. However, today I'm going to talk about we don't even know when he was or where he was born. Well, technically we do. He claimed to have been born in Fairfield, Vermont, and that's technically where he was born on his birth certificate. However, a lot of people were claiming that he could have been born in Ireland or Canada because his dad moved between Ireland and Canada, and of course the United States quite a lot. However, I think this theory is not really in reality. Hello, I'm Dazad 500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. A couple months back, I made my presidential fact of that day about how John Tyler, a president born in 1790, had a living grandson. However, just under a month ago, his grandson Harrison Ruffin Tyler died unfortunately at the age of, I want to say, 96. That's a very, very sad thing. So if you want to know who the next living president with a living grandson is, we have to go all the way to the end of the century to Grover Cleveland. Hello, I'm Dazad 500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. 32nd President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was a very important leader in American history. However, he also liked not just leading the country, but stamps. President Roosevelt had a collection of stamps that he would look at every night before he went to bed. Well, could you just imagine being in the middle of one of the bloodiest wars in history and checking your stamp collection? Hello, I'm Dazad 500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. President Chester Arthur rose to prominence in politics by being what's called a stalwart, meaning that he got through his jobs because of the people that he knew, and he would appoint the people that he knew, essentially. That's basically how he became vice president in the first place. And when James A. Garfield, the president before Chester Arthur was assassinated, the shooter said, "Hey, I'm a stalwart," and now Chester Arthur's president. And, Chester Arthur, as president, turned his back on the stalwarts, and one of the main people who helped him get so far, Roscoe Conkling, he turned his back on all of them. So that's a W in the chat for Chester Arthur. Hello, I'm Dazad 500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. As we've already talked about on this channel before, the 4th president of the United States, James Madison, was really small. He was 5'4". However, his idol, who he looked up to so much, Thomas Jefferson, was someone who he literally had to look up to. He was a foot taller than he was 6'3". Hello, I'm Dazad 500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. The generally accepted start of the U.S. Civil War was in 1861 in Fort Sumter, South Carolina. However, some people make the half-joking claim that the Civil War actually started in 1854 in Kansas. Now, why would they say that? Well, that's because in 1854, President Franklin Pierce signed into law the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which made the settlers of the territory, which would become a state of Kansas, decide if they wanted to be slave state or a free state. Of course, this caused a mad rush of pro-slavery advocates and anti-slavery advocates into Kansas, and what do you know? They started fighting each other, and there was a lot of blood shed. So that's why people say, yeah, it started in Kansas. What do you think? Hello, I'm Dazad 500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. 22nd and 24th President of the United States, Grover Cleveland, actually started off his presidential term as a bachelor, meaning he didn't have a wife. But then he eventually would get a wife, someone who was half his age, named Frances Folsom, who would actually be his friend's daughter, which is a little weird. Hello, I'm Desire500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. The second president of the United States, John Adams, born all the way in 1735 and died in 1826, lived for 90 years. Not only was that above average for the time, it was above average for presidents. He's still in the top 10 longest lived presidents. In fact, he held number 1 longest lived president of the United States until 2001, when Ronald Reagan surpassed him.